Although the Nazis and the Wehrmacht managed to occupy large swathes of Europe, including France, Poland and many of the Balkan states, there were large amounts of resistance to the occupiers during World War II. Many of the resistance groups sought to expel the Germans out of their lands. For example, there were even groups who emerged within different towns. However, they all had the same common goal: to get rid of the Nazis. Some resistance groups were more successful than others, and many actually took the fight right to the Germans. For example, the Partisans. These were a collective of anti-fascist rebels who made a significant contribution to the outcome of the Second World War, due to their sabotage operations and battles against their enemies. The Partisans would regularly try to disrupt the Wehrmacht and encourage support for the Red Army and the Communists, but they did also clash with different groups such as the Chetniks. These revolts and resistance was usually met by the Germans with brutal and savage reprisals, and they worked on a basis of every one German soldier killed, 100 civilians would be executed in return. Many of the resistors did manage to live out the conflict to tell their stories. However, a number were executed at the hands of their occupiers. Today we look at the story of Ulyana Gromova, a young 19-year-old girl who was executed by the Nazis for her role in the resistance. Today she is considered a hero of the Soviet Union and was awarded many posthumous medals as well. So join us today as we look at the brutal execution of Ulyana Gromova, and remember to support our channel. Please make sure to subscribe. Ulyana Gromova was born on the 3rd of January 1924 in a small village called Pervomusky, which today can be found in the Luhansk area of Ukraine. Her family were rather working class, and she had a rather humble upbringing. Her father Matthew was born in 1880 in Ukraine, which was part of the Russian Empire, and he served in the Russo-Japanese War. After he finished service for the Russians, he then worked as a miner, living in Krasnodon. Ulyana's mother was a housewife, and within the family she looked after all 5 children, and Ulyana was the youngest of her siblings. Not much is known about Ulyana Gromova's schooling and childhood, and it's assumed that during elementary school she was a rather studious child. Ulyana was attending the local school during the start of the Second World War, and initially it looked as if peace would exist in some capacity between the Soviets and the Germans. Prior to the conflict breaking out, the Germans and the Soviets had signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which aimed to bring about 10 years of peace between the two nations, and also the agreement decided on what would happen to Poland, with the country being split between the two nations. Peace would not last long, however, when Adolf Hitler declared that Operation Barbarossa would take place, with the Nazis planning to invade the Soviet Union. In 1940, Ulyana Gromova joined the local Komsomol, the Young Communist League. This was a youth group of the Communist Party, also known as the All-Union Leninist Young Communist League. Within the group, children would learn about communism, and the cadets would participate in building projects, for example building a tractor factory in Stalingrad. Thousands of young members participated in the collective construction works, and even worked in coal mines. But as the Second World War broke out, a few members even took up arms to fight the Germans. There were different groups of the Komsomol in many different countries across the Soviet and the Balkan states. When the Germans did invade the Soviet Union in 1941, they rampaged across the Balkans at breakneck speed, taking many of the different countries very quickly. For example, in Yugoslavia, within 10 days of the invasion beginning, Belgrade had been bombed heavily by the Luftwaffe, and the Royal Yugoslavian Army decided to surrender. Many in the Balkans also welcomed the Germans as a saviour against Bolshevism. However, pockets of resistance did emerge rather quickly. Ulyana was 17 years old and in 10th grade when the Germans invaded the Soviet Union. As the men had been drafted in to fight where she lived, she began to work in agriculture, replacing farm labourers, and she also worked at a local hospital. Here she looked after soldiers who were wounded and read to them, and also she helped them write letters home and completed various different admin jobs as well. She was living under German occupation at the time, and in June 1942 she graduated from high school with very good marks, and it looked like Ulyana had a bright future ahead of her. As her home state was occupied by the Germans, life became rather tough. The occupation of her area began on the 17th of July 1942, and at the time Ulyana was caring for her sick mother, and because of this she refused to evacuate or head to a different area. Because she was forced to stay, she decided, along with another group of young people in her village, to get together and form a youthful resistance movement. They were all rather patriotic and became part of the Youth Guard, the resistance element of their organisation. Ulyana Gromova flourished in this role, and she quickly became a member of staff within the group. In this role she helped to prepare the group for armed resistance and assaults against the Germans. She helped to also create and spread anti-Nazi propaganda and leaflets across the occupied states. She also helped to campaign amongst the locals and rally them, telling them not to obey the Germans and to help carry out acts of sabotage by disrupting local plans and refusing to work for the occupiers. She was involved in collecting medicines for the sick too, and looking after wounded members of the resistance group. Nearby, the city of Krasnodon in the Luhansk region of Ukraine had been occupied by the Nazis from the 20th of July 1942, and within the city the Youth Guard operated, conducting much of the acts of sabotage and disruption. As time went on, the group which Ulyana was helping to lead developed a reputation for sometimes successful acts of resistance. During 1942, they managed to distribute 5,000 anti-fascist leaflets within Krasnodon, released 20 prisoners from a nearby concentration camp, and they would later set fire to the German labour exchange. They also destroyed many of the vehicles that the Wehrmacht were using and set fire to ammunition and fuel dumps. However, Ulyana Gromova would take part in one act of resistance that aimed to rally the town. On the evening of November 7th, 1942, she and a friend named Popov decided to make a stand. They went over to a pipe shaft at mine number 1 in Krasnodon and raised a red flag from the pipe. It was the eve of the 25th anniversary of the October Revolution, where the Bolsheviks and the Reds began to impose their revolution onto the Soviet Union, led by Lenin. Bolshevism was the direct enemy of Nazism, as was communism, so when seeing this flag fly, the local Nazis were outraged, and they realised that there was quickly a growing communist resistance within their midst. Because of this, scores of people were arrested, being suspected of being in the underground resistance and being members or fighters of the group, and within Krasnodon, the young guards decided to try and create an escape plan for Gromova. However, this would come too late, and she was arrested by the Germans on the 10th of January 1943. As was typical with the Gestapo and the Nazis, they placed Ulyana through a gruelling ordeal during her interrogation. They were desperate to find out more about the underground resistance, and for this they decided to torture Ulyana, who was still just a teenager. During her interrogation, she was beaten to within an inch of her life, and further torture was used. She was hanged by her hair, her skin was cut into a 5-pointed star on her back, and in the bleeding wounds salt was rubbed. Her arm was broken, as were her ribs, and she was burned all over by hot irons. She refused to give up any information and kept herself strong by reciting a poem. In a letter to her relatives smuggled out of the prison, she knew she would soon be killed and said how she truly believed that victory would come. On the night before her execution, Ulyana Gromova scratched onto the walls of her prison cell with her fingernails, "I shall soon die. Dear brother, fight for your native land." After her brutal torture, she was led out of the prison on the 16th of January 1943 to a nearby mine by the local German soldiers. Alongside a number of other members of the resistance, Gromova was lined up in front of a firing squad. She stood there facing her death and was to be killed for her refusal to give over any information. Nearby the mines in Krasnodon, Ulyana Gromova was shot dead in cold blood by the Nazis. After this, her body was thrown straight into a 58-metre deep pit of mine number 5 in Krasnodon. After the city was liberated on the 14th of February 1943, almost a month after Ulyana's death, her body, along with the other members of the youth detachment killed, were dug up and reburied with full military honours in a mass grave to the heroes of the Soviet Union in the central square of Krasnodon, and today a memorial stands to the young guards. The story of Ulyana Gromova is one in which a young teenage girl tried to stand up to her Nazi occupiers and the Third Reich. Her resistance was a brave one, but her story is one which is similar. The Nazis decided to deal with acts of resistance brutally, to put them down with a vengeance, and to also deter people from doing so. With this, people like Ulyana Gromova were subjected to horrific ordeals. At the end of the day, Ulyana Gromova was just a 19-year-old girl when she was executed by the Nazis. Once again, thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.